Hello and welcome to MHD's second podcast. I'm your host and editor, Philip Hazel. We're joined today by Vinh Thai, professor at RMIT University. We're here to talk about the fuel challenges facing Australian businesses and what lessons businesses have learnt from those challenges. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Hello, Vinh. Welcome to MHD's second podcast. Thank you for joining us. We're here to talk about some of the fuel pressures that Australian businesses are experiencing at the moment. But before we get into that, I thought I'd ask, what is your experience in supply chain and where does your work intersect with fuel resilience and the pressures that businesses are currently experiencing?
Hello, Phillips, and thanks for having me today. So I'm currently a professor of logistics and supply chain management at RMIT University, and I'm also the founder of the so-called Australian Maritime Logistics Research Network. My background is in both academia and the industry, where I used to work for shipping agents, freight forwarders, container shipping lines, as well as container terminals. So I'm also the co-director of the very newly established research group at RMIT called RESUS, RESUS, which stands for Resilient and Sustainability Research for Social Impact at RMIT. Now, in recent years, part of my research, including supervising research student, PhD research student, has been very much into issues related to supply chain resilience and sustainability. So that's how my work actually intersect with what is going on in terms of fuel and supply chain pressures facing Australian businesses.
Yeah, great. And how do issues such as fuel volatility, global shipping disruption, and domestic freight costs connect with your research?
I think they are all pieces and pieces of the overall context of global supply chain resilience. For example, we currently talk about fuel volatility and global shipping disruption. They all directly affect the input of the Australian economy. We know that, for example, Australia economy, we are very much trade dependent, international trade dependence. We are surrounded by sea. So therefore, shipping is extremely important to our national economy. And fuel, we import more than 90% of our fuel from overseas. We don't import crude oil directly, let's say from the Middle East per se. However, we input the refined oil products like petrol, like diesel, like jet fuel from some Asian countries. And therefore, whatever happenings over there in the Middle East, for instance, will directly have an input on us, both directly and indirectly. For example, if we talk about diesel, right? We are very much depending on road freight in Australia domestically, so that's a direct impact. But then at the same time, um, diesel and petrol, they are also the direct input into many other sectors like manufacturing and retail and so on. So in a way, what I try to say at this stage is that, for the current volatility of fuel and global shipping disruption and so on will have a direct and indirect impacts on our national economies.
Yeah, absolutely. And the impacts are very well documented. And I don't know if you saw, the Australian Bureau of Statistics recently published a survey that found that upwards of 72% of Australian businesses are negatively impacted by the fuel pressures. So my question is, from a supply chain perspective, what does that tell us about the scale of the issue?
Yes, sure. So I saw that statistics recently as well, and just like you, Phillips, I'm also shocked with that. But then after the initial shocking sort of feeling, then I thought to myself that, well, this is in a way expected. It's not a surprise. So from a supply chain perspective, the finding that 72% of Australian businesses have been negatively affected by fuel prices or fuel availability is significant. It indicates that fuel is not simply a transport sector issue, because we said that for many sort of segment of the transport industry, like shipping, like road freight, for example, are very much depending on that. It is not simply, as I said, a transport sector issue, but it is very much a systemic supply chain risk affecting the entire economy. Now, this suggests that fuel disruption propagate throughout the supply network rather than remaining confined to only the freight operator or logistic operators. Obviously, there is a chain effect here where all the players and all the aspects in the supply chain are affected. For example, in terms of transportation costs, procurement costs, and distribution costs, etc. Fuel costs are embedded in virtually every economic activities, and we can see this impact in the virtually in the context of Australia, virtually in many sectors like not only the transport but also manufacturing, agriculture, retail, construction, mining, healthcare, hospitality. Um, and this is not a surprise to me, Phillips, and I emphasize right from the beginning because yes, we talk about fuel, but don't forget that we also have the concept of petrochemicals, right? So from crude oil and then from natural gas, they made some intermediate products, and from those several or about around 4 or 5 intermediate products, they then make more than 6,000 products in our life. So as a matter of fact, because of that, right, the effect is so much, multiplied. Now, the other aspect of this impact is not only about fuel costs, but also about fuel availability. Now, a business can sometimes absorb higher costs, especially during short periods of time, but it cannot operate if fuel is unavailable, especially for transport, for machinery, or for distribution. And therefore, I would say that, fuel availability is related to business continuity or resilient, not only at a firm level, but also at the macro national economy level as well.
Yeah, and the fuel availability aspect is pretty obvious, but do you think the chain impacts are understated?
I would think so because if you look at the current government's measures to help alleviate the situation of fuel volatility, I think, as I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, there are two aspects of it. One is fuel cost, but the other one is fuel availability. So the current measures that we have been seeing from the government perspective are very much focused on the cost issue. But at the same time, we need to make sure that fuel availability is there for business and for the whole national economy. Because yes, in short term, firms can be alleviated from the cost, especially with the government measures. But if fuel availability is not there in medium and long term, that will have a tremendous impact on the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing that some sectors are more impacted than others. So the ABS data shows that manufacturing and retail networks are more exposed than other sectors. Why do you think that is?
Yes, as I also emphasized earlier, Phillips, right? I mean, the current, let's say, crisis, and the reason why I say current, although we know that, just a couple of days ago, U.S. And Iran, they just reached an agreement, although the official ratification of the agreement would be in 2 days' time. And the people may say that, okay, it's already stopped. I don't think so because the impact is going to be prolonged for several months, at least from now until the end of the year. So going back to the question, right, the impact is very much following a chain effect and many sectors are affected. The transport sector, as we would think about, is the direct sort of absorber of the impact because in the context of Australia, where in terms of geography, we are very much dispersed between the port and the consumer centers, and the distance of transport is long, and therefore road freight is extremely important, and they very much depends on very much relies on fuel imported from overseas. So they are actually the first and the hardest hit because fuel is a major operating expense for them. And then after the transport is a manufacturer because they would first of course, I mean in some factory, right, they depends on diesel and petrol to run the machine. And at the same time, they pay for transport and logistic costs, which is directly hit by the transport sector. Retailers would be, I would say, generally less exposed directly, but they are highly exposed indirectly to their supply network. So say, for example, if the manufacturers, the logistic operators, and the warehouse operators, they are all affected. Even agriculture as well. I mean, if the farmer, they cannot get enough fuel and affordable fuel for their machine to work on the farms, then everything would then be, passed on down the chain to the retailers. And of course, Philip, I would say don't forget about the regional businesses as well. And this is especially sort of applicable in the context of Australia, where we have a lot of small town dispersely located far away from the economic centers, right? So they are very much depending on the availability of logistic and transport, from those major distribution center to them. So if the fuel cost is so expensive and availability is scarce, that will directly hitting, the viability of the regional businesses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was reported that a lot of regional businesses had less access to diesel than businesses that were in city centres. What does that
Correct.
tell us about Australian supply chains?
I think the Australian supply chain is very much unique. First of all, because of the geography characteristic, right? So we are the big countries, vast master plan. However, economic center are center along the coast, especially in the east coast, right? We still have a lot of population center in the middle, in the back, in the mainland, but very few sort of population and the long distance. So because of those characteristics, right, we are so much depending on road freight. I would say, right, to some extent, if you look at the modal share, right, a majority of our let's say freight transport, especially from the major economic center to the regional area, are by trucks, and they are very much depending on the diesel. So we can think about, reconfiguration of the supply chain in medium and long term. That is another topic of discussion, Phillips. I would not dare to say that the chain will be very immediate, because we need to restructure the whole system. And talking about again the fuel, if you want to change from road freight to rail freight, for example, or even for road freight, if you change from diesel dependent to electrification, for example, this is the program that the government is trying to promote right now. It will take some time, right? Because the volumes of transportation to those regional area from economic centers, we cannot ignore, right? And in the short term, the solution is going to be not going to be very immediate.
I see. And without going on too much of a tangent, is there much capacity to explore intermodal options when it comes to, say, regional and central Australia?
I would well, I put this way. What first of all, let's talk about the option, right? To in order to reduce the dependent level. So the very first option is modal share split. We try to increase the rail freight. We try to increase the rail freight, for example, right, by electrification of the rail. But if if we talk about a short distance of rail freight, that's okay, right? That can happen within a short period of time. But if we talk about the long distance transportation by rail, we still rely on the diesel locomotive, and those locomotive, they are very much depending on the diesel availability as well as the cost. So that is one particular limit that we have. The other option is, as I touched upon a little bit earlier, is the electrification of our road freight system. As far as I know, some logistic company in Australia, with the help from ARENA, the Australian Renewable Agency, they have already got a fund, to sponsor the transition part of their fleet from from diesel sort of vehicle to electric battery vehicle. But that is just the start, right? The adoption of BEV, the battery electric vehicles, in the context of Australia is quite slow. It's still slow compared to other, landscape like Europe or especially in Asia. So that will take some time, right, for the transition to happen effectively and efficiently. And of course, I mean, the other option is when we talk about the decarbonization of the whole network, right? So battery electric vehicle is just one particular option. That is the road freight, but we also talk about, the electrification not only at the road freight, but also in other sector of transport as well. So we will take all together systematically. It will take some time, and I don't think it's gonna, happen very quickly within a very short piece of time.
No, probably not. And just on electrification, is it fair to say that the infrastructure just does not exist?
I could not say the infrastructure does not exist. It just started to take a shape, and it will take some times, right? So installing, let's say, investment from Arena with the help from Arena, investment in the BEV is only one part of the whole supply chain network. We know that. So in the normal sort of traditional supply chain network configuration, we have the node and the link, right? So for the link, we talk about the transportation link, right? I mean, so let's say road freight. Yes, some companies have already started to invest in the BEV, battery electric vehicles. But then those BEV, they will need to be charged, right, from time to time. After, charging on the energy from the BEV, they need to go to a particular station for charging. Now, those charging station can be established at the depots of the logistic company, but at the same time, they will need to develop a network of those charging stations, not only at the depot of the logistic company, but also at the customer side as well. And not only that, sometimes somewhere, in the network, in the middle of the network. So what I try to say here is that, yes, it started to take shape, but it is not yet, let's say, reach a level of full sort of configure network, in terms of infrastructure, as you mentioned, Philips. So I wouldn't dare to say that it's not there, it doesn't exist. It has already taken shape, but it will take some time to be, developed into the full level. Now, just on top of that, I just would like to add, I'm sure you're aware recently, right? BYD, right? BYD, the Chinese automobile electric automobile manufacturer, they had a very first maiden call of their vessel, right? A maiden call of their vessel from China to Melbourne, right? So carrying several thousands of electric cars. So we have not seen that in the past, right? And it's just because of the let's say, ongoing conflict, although it's officially put that way, ended a couple of days ago, but the ongoing sort of impact is still on. So let me use the term ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, in Iran. Just because of that, at the beginning of March, we started to see the increased, let's say, presence of electric vehicles on the road. And because of that, BYD, they had decided, they made the very first maiden call of that vessel. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, because of the conflict, as a catalyst, we have seen some sort of, speed up of the process, right? So more electric vehicle coming in, that's mean it will be a catalyst for the company, for the player in the supply chain to think about investing more on the infrastructure, including the charging infrastructure, for example. So in the time to come, I would expect to see, more of that happening in the context of Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to go back to the prolonged effects of the fuel crisis. You did mention that America did strike a deal with Iran, and the ongoing conflict is sort of declared over. Um, if that happens to stay as it is, what are these prolonged impacts, and how would they manifest, say, on a manufacturing floor or in a retailer's warehouse?
Uh, yes, thankfully for the question. I think it's a I would say $1 million questions. Now let's take a step back. Okay, we look at the Strait of Hormuz, right, which facilitate around 20% of the world energy flow in terms of crude oil and natural gas. So yes, I mean they say that the deal has been sort of agreed upon, officially taken shape 2 days from now. Hopefully, no major hiccup happening from now until then. the question is whether everything will be back to normal immediately. My answer would be no, right? It will take some time because remember that, first of all, hundreds vessels are stuck within the Gulf of Persian Gulf, right? So it takes some time for them to slowly getting out. And the reason why I say it takes some time for them to slowly getting out because torpedoes that Iran deploy in the strait somewhere, it will take some time for them to clear, and it will take some time for the ship owners, for the shipping line to regain their confidence that they can use the strait safe and sound again. Right. So it takes some time for those ships to get out. Then, because those ships have been stuck there, couldn't get out. Now they're getting out, and the port along the Persian Gulf, right? The oil exporting port over there, they have been keeping stockpile of oil for some times. Now it takes some time for the new flow of ship to come in and then take those oil and gas out, right? And then it will take some time for them to repair some of the infrastructure over there, which were damaged because of the war, right? So I would say there are three stages like that happening, and it will not happen concurrently at the same time,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It will take some time for them to complete one state before moving to the other state. So going back to your questions, so what does that mean? What does that mean? In the context of Australia, yes, as we have seen in the last couple of days, the price of oils has been positively for us, right? Reduced a little bit. But I would say it is still volatile because remember that, for the price of oil in the market is subject to many factors, both from the supply and demand perspective, right? So it is still a little bit volatile, although we say that in a positive way, right? Not unexpectedly negative like it was before. Now, in the context of Australia, what does that mean for manufacturing, for retail? We should, personally, I would say we should not be happy that, okay, the Strait of Hormuz is now clear and then everything back to normal. What are we learning from this, right? Things like that can happen anytime, unexpectedly. So we shouldn't be in the position where, okay, things already happen like that, and therefore we just rely on the government. I mean, from the business perspective, they have to be proactively do something in order to prepare and respond better in the future when things like that happen. Not only fuel shock, but any similar kinds of disruption in the supply chain, right? So fuel dependency is one major thing in the context of Australia because of the geography, because of the dependent on the supply side that we touched on that previously, Philip. For example, right, I mean, more than 90% of oil we import from overseas. I mean, the refined oil we import from overseas. Um, yes, we can say that, for the cost efficiency purpose, we can do that. We rely on that. But remember that when things like the current conflict happen, some so-called friendly supplier to Australia, they may need to prioritize their domestic consumption. And we say, sorry, but we have to, ensure that our people in the countries get the fuel first before supplying to you. Right. So we cannot just rely on that. We have to build our own sort of control in the future moving forward. I mean, learning from the current conflict.
I see. And the ultimate message is that businesses shouldn't be complacent, right? And that's a conversation of resilience. But before we get into that, I wanted to touch on the government support. And the government has released a bunch of initiatives to help businesses in Australia, such as the National Fuel Security Plan. And my question is, what has historically these plans been a help to businesses, and does the government need to be looking at what's happening now and prepare accordingly to the future?
Sure. I think, yes, you mentioned, Phillips, about the government support. And of course, in the context of Australia, everyone now is talking about the National Fuel Security Plan, right? So from my perspective, I think the government has been doing a good job in terms of establishing measures like that, which help to increase, in a way, fuel stock holding, support for domestic fuel infrastructure, and strategic fuel reserve, which altogether address an important vulnerability in Australia's supply chain, as we have been discussing so far. However, I think they primarily improve fuel availability and national resilience, whereas many of those challenges the business are facing are very much not only related to the affordability but also the availability as well. So from the supply chain perspective, government's role during a fuel supply shock like this is not only to eliminate on the market impact, but they also need to maintain the continuity of critical supply chain, try to minimize economic disruption, and support an orderly adjustment by businesses and consumer. So if you ask me, for example, whether or not those current measures are enough, are sufficient, I would say they're necessary, but not yet necessarily sufficient. So all the current measures are helping to basically address the issue of availability, at least in short terms. But affordability is another sort of aspect that the business are facing, right? Because we know very well that if business cannot afford the fuel cost, they can hold it within a very short period of time. They can try to absorb it within a very short period of time, but then in medium and long term, they have to pass on. They have to pass on to to the next subsequent player in their supply chain, and eventually, people like you and me, we will need to absorb all these things, right? When we go to supermarket, we buy something, or when we go to the petrol station to buy the fuel. So from the government perspective, I would say yes, the responses so far are necessary, but more need to be done in order to ensure the affordability aspect of the fuel supply chain.
I see. So, in your opinion, what can the government be doing to address the affordability of fuel going forward?
My perspective is that, right? I mean, the government will need to apply a multi-tongs or multi-prong, multi-tong, or let's say diversification of the approach. So currently, of course, the government has been doing to increase the national fuel reserve, right, by multi sourcing, by diversifying the procurement sources from different countries. So traditionally, for example, we often buy from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Brunei, from South Korea in particular. So recently, we have been trying as well to buy from other sources, like from Japan and some country in Africa as well. Uh, but in my perspective, right, that is just only the so-called outward measures. We also need to focus on the inward measures, which means building our own capabilities. Now, what does that mean? So we used to have several oil refineries in the past, right? And then we closed some. We are now down to two. And with recent fire, in the one in Geelong, we were in the sort of constrained position. Now, what does that mean? I didn't mean to say that we have to revise, on the old oil refineries. We have to build everything on our own. We don't necessarily have to do that. The multi-pronged approach here means, yes, on the outside, we try to diversify our source of supply. On the inside, we have to build our own capability. For example, we have to do something, I mean, led by the government's initiative, we have to implement measures to reduce our dependence on the fossil fuel energy. So what does that mean? Electrification, decarbonization, I mean, the using alternative fuels is one particular way that the government is trying to promote. But more importantly is to scale down that, or let's say, though initiative from the government level to the business level. Because what does that mean? At the business level, right? Firm may say, well, decarbonization is good for the environment, good for mankind, and good for the earth, and so on, but it cannot come to the very high cost level, because if we cannot afford, we have to pass on the cost to the end users, and the end users say no, we cannot afford, then we have to go back to the traditional fossil fuel sort of alternative, right? So lots of things can be sort of talk about that in this space. Philip, for example, how are you going to make the commercialization much more affordable in terms of alternative fuel? That require a bit of investment from the government level in terms of R&D, research and development, in order to promote the research and development in that space, so that in medium and long term the commercial viability can be attained. So that is one particular initiative, or let's say inward measure that I mentioned earlier, building our own capability to be less dependent on fossil fuel and to be more sort of in control, independence in other sort of alternative energies, and we have to put this way. Let me just add one more thing. For example, Australia is known to be the net exporter of energy, but not in terms of oil, right? In terms of gas, in terms of other things. So why can't we actually turn that sort of export advantage to be our own domestic competitive advantage as well? You see, so I mean, there is no one size fit all sort of a solution here. I mean, on the one side, you have to diversify the source supply of what you are currently buying, but on the other side, you have to build our own capability to be less dependent on that, so that in medium and long term, you can transition to other things that you are in control.
I see.
That is the key message. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you think the path for Australia now is that we should be veering away from fossil fuels and that decarbonisation and electrification is the way we can improve our total capability when it comes to energy?
Diversification is, in my opinion, in the name of the game. And that apply both in short, medium, and long term. So in short term, I do not think that we can switch immediately, from fossil fuel, relying on fossil fuel into something else, right? It will take some time. Now, let me draw your attention, Philip, to a recent article written by a journalist for The Guardian in Sydney. So she did an experiment. I'm not sure whether you have read about this. She did an experiment. She say, well, let me try not to depend on petrochemicals for 24 hours for one day, right? So in the morning, she got off, she got into the bathroom, she tried to brush her teeth. Oh, well, the toothbrush that she's holding, that is from petrochemical. Anyway, cutting the long story short, she tried so much to do to maintain her normal daily life without relying on petrochemicals. So at the end of the day, she survived, but she acknowledged that, oh gosh, it is extremely hard. It is miserable. Now, what did that tell me? My interpretation, as I mentioned earlier to you, right, from these from crude oil and natural gas, they made about 4 or 5 intermediate products. From those 4 or 5 intermediate products, they made about more than 6,000 products that we are using every day. What does mean behind the scene? Behind the scene, the manufacturing system, the logistic and supply chain system are very complicated and well established over the years. You want to break that in order to switch to some alternative fuel, you can, but there are two aspects of two hindrances. One is time, right? Because in order to break the existing configuration or system or network that you have been built over the years within very short periods of time, it is not possible, right? It takes some time for that. The second aspect, or let's say second barrier, is the commercial viability. Yes, for your information, recently I responded to media interview. I wrote an article on the conversation about the price of chocolate. And people said, well, I mean, the price of chocolate this year is so expensive. On the price of cocoa, the main ingredient, has been reducing, right? In the last 2 years or so. Why? Well, there are many factors of that. So one particular solution, let's say, is to switch from the normal cocoa-based chocolate into synthesized chocolate, right? It is possible, but it then bring up another issue. For example, for let's say traditional chocolate lovers, they say, well, what is chocolate looking like without cocoa in it, right? So
It's
that's
not
one
really
thing.
chocolate, is it?
That's right. And the other is the commercial viability, right? Within very short periods of time, you can have those alternative products, but how much you can pay for that, right? If you cannot, let's say, produce in mass production, in mass scale, the retail price can be at the price where you cannot commercially consume every day, for example. So it takes some time as well. So to go back to your answer, Philip, yes, of course, I mean, learning from the current conflict, we have to be, I normally say, we have to be in control of the situation, right? So in order to be in control of the situation, it would take some time to build our own capability to be in control of the position, both from outside as well from both from outward as well as from the inward perspective. We need to move away from. Okay, let me take that aspect. I wouldn't say we need to move away, but we have to be slowly transition, right, from fossil fuel dependent into something else which we are in control. And when we say in control, that means we shouldn't be 100%, let's say, depends on the outside factors like the outside suppliers, for example. We have to use a multi-pronged approach, as we mentioned earlier, but we have to be in control of the situation and slowly transition into something that we can be in control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to touch on what companies and businesses can do individually, apart from the government, to enhance their resilience. So, my question is, what should businesses be doing to prepare for shocks like this? And does it mean that businesses have to be doing monthly health checks or something like that? What can be done?
Again, that's $1 million questions at the business level. What should they do learning from the shock like this? Now, first thing I would like to emphasize that, the fuel shock like this, um, is not the first time it happens, right? It happened in the past. That's number one. The second aspect I would like to emphasize that, fuel shock is just one particular type of disruption that we experience, right? So in the future, we may see fuel shocks, but we may also see different kinds of other kind of shock as well. So business always need to prepare, right? First of all, I would say the emphasis should not be about cost efficiency anymore. Now, by saying that, I didn't mean to say that, business shouldn't be bothered about cost efficiency. It's always there. But the focus now, given what we have been going through, is not only about cost efficiency, but it is more as well about when things like this happen, you know exactly what you should do. Now, in a nutshell, what does that means, right? What does that means? So the most important lesson learning from this sort of periods is that businesses should not wait for the fuel shock or similar event like this to happen and to start thinking about their fuel risk, or let's say risk portfolio. Um, because by the time fuel prices spike or supply become very much constrained, many of the most effective options are no longer available there. So businesses that cope best are usually those that have already identified fuel at a strategic risk and build their contingency measures into their operation, in their daily, sort of operation. So when something wrong happens, they know exactly what they need to do. So if we want to elaborate this a little bit, there are many things that I think business will need to do, right? So very first thing they need to do is to do the mapping of their supply chain. So I will not touch upon fuel shock as a particular example, but as I said earlier, Phillips, that there are many other similar kind of, shock that may happen. So they will need to map out the supply chain, identify where the pain point can be, and identify whether or not those pain points are totally under their direct control, or those pain points are actually indirectly under their direct control. What does mean is that the pain point may exist at their supplier tier one supply level, or maybe tier two supply level, right? So they need to map out everything, identify the pain point, and then and build up the resilient capability to deal with them. So they need to have the visibility across their supply chain network, and identifies where things may go wrong, how it go wrong, and when it can go wrong, and then build up some sort of a response strategy. Uh, and if we talk about a response strategy, there are many of them, right? I would say let's say start with the so-called resilient capabilities. Normally we say, what does that mean, resilient capability? Normally we talk about the three, let's say, interrelated capability in order to make firms or their supply chains more resilient. Number one is the capability to predict what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, where it's going to happen. And number two is the capability to respond. Okay, we cannot eliminate the possibility that thing may go wrong somewhere, somehow, right? But the more important thing is when those things happen, okay, that's fine. We have the mindset to accept it because it's already happened. And then we know exactly, we have the plan step by step of action, what to do to respond to those. So that's the second capability. And the third capability is the capability to adapt. Now, what does mean is when something wrong happens, you may no longer operate the same way that you have been doing. You may need to change. You may need to adapt. You may need to reconfigure your supply chain network. You may need to, let's say, switch to a new business model of doing things. And more importantly, building up on that third capability is to learn from what already happens and then come up with new things of operating in the future. So if the businesses in general, they have that sort of resilient capability, incorporating, on those three aspect of capability, I think then whatever we talk about the new normal or the normal of the new normal in the future, firm would be able to, absorb uh, things when it's go wrong, and then continue at normal, and then evolve from, the situation as well.
I see. And I believe you've helped to develop a tool that can guide businesses during shocks like this. Did you want to share what that was?
Yes. So thanks, Philip, for asking the question. So that is what I call the ROPMIS resilient health check. Now, where does this come from? In the past, I developed a tool called ROPMIS, resources, outcome, processes, management, image, and social responsibility. That ROPMIS tool is a tool I developed to measure service quality of firms in the logistics supply chain industry. And recently, I revised the tool. I changed the I and the S to become information and strategy, and turn this into the so-called a tool for the firm, for the businesses to self-diagnose their resilient capability. Now, the context of this is recently Tone Group, and we know, one of the leading logistics service providers in Australia. Tone approached me and invited me to be a keynote speaker in one of their very first global webinar for the customers. So I introduced the tool. In the webinar, we discussed about, the conflict in Iran and the responses and things like that. And I introduced a tool. Now, what does that mean here? So R stand for resources. In order to self check, right? Firms, they can ask questions like, well, in terms of resources, do we have buffer? Do we have strategic buffer? Do we have redundancy, to switch from one to the other so when something go wrong with the current one that we're using? Now, in terms of outcomes, can we still meet customer deadlines if our primary shipping route is blocked for 14 days, for example? Similar to the case of the Strait Hormuz, or it may happen as well, with the Red Sea situation. Processes mean, do we have plan B or not? Or sometimes plan C, right? And this apply not only to, the manufacturing, but also procurement, also IT system, for example. Management, our leadership prioritize long-term stability over short-term low-cost saving. And we touched upon earlier, Phillips, right? The focus now of supply chain management is no longer on cost efficiency alone, but we have to touch upon on when something wrong happens, do we have the capability, to move on, right? So that's a mindset starting from the leaders, from the management. Information mean, do we have real-time visibility of where a shipment is right now? For example, that's one particular, sample question that firm will need to ask. So that is built on the role of data, built on the capability of visibility throughout the supply chain. And then last but not least is S, which is about strategy. So do we have strategy in place, right, to respond and adapt? Attaching to the capability to respond and the capability to adapt that I mentioned earlier when we discuss about resilient capability. So what I'm trying to say is that with this sort of ROPMIS resilient health check tool, businesses do not need to wait until something wrong happened and then scratch their head and say what we got to do, or they may not necessarily have to go to a professional consultancy firm for their solution. I mean, simple thing that they can do in their everyday sort of operation by using the ROPMIS resilient health check tool like this. They can basically, based on this, to develop a kind of risk portfolio. And then based on this risk portfolio, they can assess how resilient their capability is. And then based on that assessment of their resilient capability, they can work out, okay, what we want to do about that. So what I'm trying to say is that by using a simple tool like this, it may help firm, for right here, right now, rather than waiting for some time later.
That's right. And I guess the ultimate message is that companies shouldn't be complacent and they should be asking the hard questions now, right?
Yes, that's right. Don't wait, because you never know. As I said earlier, Phillips, right? We like you. I have been also very happy to hear that U.S. and Iran has finally agreed on something. Not because I love America or Iran, but because we know that, okay, with that news, the price of oil is going to drop. And then when we bring our car to the petrol station, we are going to see, some saving. As well as when we go to supermarket, hopefully in medium terms, we'll see, the price of some of the commodity will be sort of manageable again. That is the thing. However, as I said earlier, I hope there is no hiccup. You see, because now, even if we talk about that agreement between the US and Iran, right? President Donald Trump, he said, okay, this is what we agree upon. From the Iran side, they said, no, that is not what we agree upon. We need some time to make everything in details, right? So there are still some differences between them, and well, let hope for the best. Put that
Yeah,
way, right?
fingers
Let hope
crossed.
that there is
Fingers
no
crossed
hiccup
it
at
all
all.
gets resolved.
Yep.
And if there was one final message that you could tell Australian businesses, what would it be?
I was well. The difficult answer to your question is there are more than one thing, right? There are more than one thing to tell them. However, if the case is there are only one, let's say, things that they need to focus on, I would say that it starts with the mindset. Now, I mean, in the ROPMIS tool earlier, there is a M, which is management. That's very important, right? The change have to start with the mindset, and the mindset change need to start with the senior management. So if the firms has always been thinking about operating supply chain for efficiency, unfortunately, it is no longer the case. The mindset have to change. Something wrong may happen somewhere, somehow. So it is not the questions what we are going to do or what should we do when that something happen. It should be more on, okay, this is a thing already happened. Let's do it. We already have the plan. So just follow the staff, do it, and bring our business back to normal as quickly as possible and adapt, more importantly. Adapt in order to do better in the future and adapt to respond, much more effectively and efficiently when something wrong happen again in the future. So I would say there are many things to talk about change that need to be made, but I would say the most important things is the change in the mindset, the change in the focus, and that should start with the senior management, Phillips.
I see. A lot to consider for Australian businesses. Well, I think that is all we have time for today. I want to thank you for joining us, Vin, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure, Phillips. Thanks again for having me today. And you too. Have a nice day today.
Thank you for joining us for our second podcast. We hope you enjoyed. If you'd like to see more, you can reach us on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Thank you.